Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival online. My name is Kathy Hunter, and I'm very happy to be hosting this afternoon's session from Stromness in Orkney. This year marks the Orkney International Science Festival's 30th anniversary, and we are celebrating the occasion with our very first online festival. We are delighted to be able to bring a full festival programme directly to you, wherever you happen to be for the moment. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker of the day, Carmen Amador. Carmen is a postdoctoral researcher at the MRC Human Genetics Unit. Carmen studied biology at Universidad Complutense in Madrid and undertook her PhD working in conservation genetics in Dr. Jesus Fernandez's group at INIA in Madrid. In 2013, she moved to Scotland to work in Chris Haley's research group at the University of Edinburgh. Her current research interest focuses on complex traits, particularly in the interaction between genetic and environmental causes of variation. We're very much looking forward to hearing from Carmen this afternoon, and we hope you enjoy her talk. If you have any questions for Carmen as we go along, please pop them into YouTube's live chat, and we'll go through them at the end. So now, over to Dr. Carmen Amador with her talk, In Our Genes or in Our Lives? Carmen.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen well? Well, I assume you can.
Yes, we can, Carmen, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. My name is Carmen Amador, and today I'm going to talk about health and disease and the impact of our genes and our lifestyles on them. I would like to thank you all for joining today and the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I am originally from Spain, from a city called Valladolid, and I'm just saying this because in about 3 slides I need to pronounce the names of a council area in Scotland, and I only get it right about 30% of the time, so please be gentle with me. I currently work in the MRC Human Genetics Unit in the University of Edinburgh, although strictly speaking, I currently work at my house because these are the new times that we're living in. I think it's a great shame not being able to use this opportunity to visit Orkney. I was quite looking forward to that, but instead here I am at my house. But I just hope that this format reaches a lot of people in many other places that, apart from being inspired from the science and the genetic research that I want to present today, they will also learn that they need to visit Orkney whenever that is possible. So moving on to the proper science. I'm sure you've heard many times things like this disease runs in the family, or they inherited that condition from their father. But what does this mean? Many common diseases are influenced by our genes. Each one of us have received our genetic information from our parents. Half of it comes from our mother, and half of it comes from our father. This genetic material is contained in each of the cells of our body, and it does multiple things. For example, it encodes harmless things like the color of your eyes or if you have a chin dimple. But also, it can increase our chances to get sick for a large number of disorders like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, the risk of being depressed or having some types of cancer. All of these things are affected by our genes. Many scientists work hard to identify which genes play a role in these diseases in order to find cures or to be able to diagnose them quickly. However, we know that it's not only genes that have an influence on disorder, but other external factors like the food we eat, how much we exercise, or how much alcohol we drink have a big impact on them. We sometimes call this the environment of a person, or the environmental effects affecting a person. To make the picture more complicated, the relationship between genetics and environment is not simple. There is some genetic control over some of the environments. So your genes, for example, contribute to some of these choices, like what sort of foods you like or how much you exercise. But while your environment cannot change your genes, it can actually modify how your genes contribute to the risk of disease. So, for example, a gene that increases your risk of cardiovascular disease might be exacerbated by eating certain diets. So the risk is not just the sum of the two, but it's boosted by the fact of you have the two. So as you can see, this picture is not easy, and it's my aim to try and disentangle. My research focuses on trying to separate these two causes of disease in a precision medicine framework. Precision medicine or personal medicine is an emerging approach for disease treatment and prevention that takes into account individual variability in genes, environment, and lifestyle for each person. The final aim would be to predict who will get sick and find the specific solutions targeted at each patient's specific circumstances. So instead of finding general solutions for everybody, we try to find something that works more appropriately for each person in their circumstances. On top of that, I've also done some research trying to identify the reasons behind health inequalities. So differences in health between areas of the world. And this is what I would like to show you today. So how important are these health differences? Well, I think the answer to that question is very important. For example, this map shows the differences in life expectancy between countries in 2019. Life expectancy measures how long a person is expected to live on average if born in that particular year. Most Western European countries have life expectancies above 80 years of age. It's quite straightforward to understand that people are not expected to live the same if they're born in Europe or in Asia or in Africa or in America. And some of the reasons behind this are quite intuitive. However, sometimes these differences are a little bit more surprising because they don't occur exclusively between countries, but we can observe them within countries too. This graph is equivalent to the one before, but instead of a map, we have a list of council areas in Scotland and the life expectancies of those council areas. The first thing that you can see is that on average, women live longer than men. Over here, women live longer than men. Yes. But there are also things that come across quite straightforward. For example, in Orkney, people are expected to live about 80 years of age, which is good, I think. But also you can find other differences. For example, men born in Glasgow in 2017 are expected to live 73 years, while men born in East Redfrewshire are expected to live 80 years. This is a gap of 7 years, which is, I think, massive, taking into account that we're talking about the same country, but particularly because the distance between these two areas is just 10 miles. We can find other examples, for example, for diseases. These are showing differences, this plot over here are showing differences in incidence of obesity between the Scottish health boards in 2015. Health boards are also areas in Scotland, but a little bit larger than the council areas. You can see that while the incidence in Scotland is on average 28%, there are places like the Western Isles where the incidence is 36%, and places like the Lothians where the incidence is just 23%. Again, these discrepancies are quite big and can be observed across other diseases as well. There are differences between incidence of cardiovascular disease, mental health issues, but for now, let's focus just on obesity. Okay, so we know that there are differences in obesity incidence between the regions. What could be causing them? To cover all of our bases, we need to think of what things have an effect on obesity. The sex and age of the individuals have an effect on obesity. However, these two are generally accounted for when we're trying to measure the inequalities. In the graphs I showed before, we were separating men and women, and we could still see that there were differences. And the differences in age are generally not that large between the councils for them to be driving the differences in the incidence of obesity between the councils. We know that obesity has a genetic component. Your genes contribute to your risk of becoming obese. So if there are genetic differences between the council areas, that could be a reason for the incidence of obesity to vary between the regions. But then, as we mentioned before, there are other causes of variation that affect your obesity risk. Some of them are socioeconomic, and some of them are more related to lifestyles. We know that things like diet, physical activity have an effect on obesity. Equally, smoking and alcohol intake affect your obesity risk. Other associations are related to the area where you live in, to your access of education, healthcare, jobs, etc. We need to take this into account as well. So we know that genetic and environmental factors affect obesity. How can we study if one of them or both of them are responsible for the fact that the incidence of obesity is different between the regions in Scotland? To do that, we need to check if there are genetic differences between the councils and if there are environmental differences between the councils. So these two could be responsible for the overall differences in obesity. Let's talk about genetic first. There are several studies showing that we can use genetic information to infer where individuals come from. You might have seen that some DNA testing companies can use your genome to tell you about your ancestry. You give a blood or a saliva sample, and then they extract your DNA and they measure some genetic markers, and they can tell you that, for example, you are 72% British and Irish ancestry, and then learn that you have 3% Scandinavian and 25% Southern European. It's very easy to separate populations that are quite different from each other. Like in this example, British, Scandinavian, and Italian are quite distinctive from each other. But it is a little bit more challenging when the populations are more homogeneous, like the Scottish population. So differentiating between regions in Scotland is much harder. However, although it's not that simple, some studies have shown that this is possible, and we can try to identify where in Scotland different people come from using their genes. The prediction can be more or less accurate depending on the information that we have to compare. In a study in 2014, we managed to do a decent prediction of the origin within Scotland based on genetic differences. The image at the left shows where individuals in our sample came from in different colors, and the size of the bubble represents how many individuals came from that specific area. The image in the right shows our prediction. As you can see in the image, we cannot predict exactly where people come from. For example, we do poorly when predicting if people came from the Isles, but that's driven by the fact that we didn't have enough number of samples. However, if you see the colors, you can see that we are predicting quite well the 3 cities where most of our samples came from. In green over here, people from Glasgow, in purple in the middle, people from Dundee, and in more yellowish, people from Aberdeen. It is not perfect, but it provides very valuable information. And actually, more recently, and using more data, this other study managed to disentangle quite accurately the genetic differences between different origins in the British Isles. One of the findings of this study was that Orkney and Shetland had the highest levels of Norwegian ancestry outside Scandinavia. This is a different story for another time. Okay, so we've seen that there are genetic differences. What about the environmental ones? There are plenty of data showing that lifestyle and socioeconomic characteristics are different between regions in Scotland. I'm just going to show one little example. The SIMD, the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, is a deprivation measure calculated by the Scottish government to identify areas of multiple deprivation in Scotland. You can go to this website over here, and you can find a map where you can see these different deprivation measures in your area and how they compare with other areas in Scotland. It is a very interesting tool. But I think it's important to say, firstly, that deprived does not mean low income. It can also mean that people have fewer resources and opportunities, for example, in access to health and education. And secondly, that to understand it correctly, you need to think that the SIMD is an area-based measure of relative deprivation. So it's an area measure. It doesn't mean that every person in a deprived area will themselves be experiencing high levels of deprivation. In any case, this is just one example of many, showing that the environmental differences are common between Scottish regions. Okay, so now we know that obesity varies between regions, and so does genetics, and so does the environment. So either of the two could be driving the differences in obesity between the regions. So now we just need to check which one is causing the differences in obesity. There is an inherently difficulty in this because I've been talking about genetic differences and environmental differences as if they were both very easily separated. But the thing is that generally people with Orcadian genes and people living in Orkney are kind of the same people. Obviously, this doesn't apply to everybody, but unless we have very detailed and a lot of information with, for example, people with Orcadian genes living in Edinburgh and the other way around, these two things are difficult to separate. So we need to have very good data. But luckily, this is the sort of information that we have. Generation Scotland is a Scottish cohort that started in 2006. It consists of over 20,000 individuals above 80 years old, many of them in family groups. We have information of small families, individuals that are not related with anybody else in the cohort, but also very large families with individuals from 3 generations and their partners. This makes it particularly valuable. We have health-related information with measures of obesity-related traits, environmental information as how much they smoke, if they drink, what they eat, physical activity information, and we have genetic information from a blood sample. Okay, so now we want to separate the effects of genetics and the environment, and we're going to use Generation Scotland for that. From these two sources of information, we can use different things. Genetic relationships. We can measure from their genetic information if people are genetically more or less alike, to see how that contributes to how similar they are in terms of obesity. Also, it's important to include in these models how individuals are related to each other, because some of them are going to be distant relatives or not related at all, but others will be couples, others will be part of the same family, or siblings. And these relationships are important, and we can make use of them because of how Generation Scotland was designed. We are also going to use this genetic stratification, this prediction of where individuals are genetically from that I showed you before. So how genes between the regions differ. And from the environmental part, we know where in Scotland each person lives, and this is a useful part because in combination with the genetic prediction on where they genetically come from, we will have some information from people that maybe have Orcadian genes but are now living in Glasgow, and we can find these small differences between all the possible combinations. And we're also going to use information on their diets, physical activity, socioeconomic status, and things like that. But I will give you a bit more details about this in a minute. To examine obesity, we're going to take a look at 4 measures in the Generation Scotland individuals. The first one is actually not related to obesity, and it's just the height of the people. We include this one as a little bit of a control because we don't expect to find the same things that in obesity-related measures. The second one is individual's body mass index. Body mass index is a way of measuring obesity, and it's calculated just by dividing each individual's weight by their square height. And it provides a value that is used to describe if individuals are normal weight or outside of that range. It's not a perfect measure of obesity, but in general works well. A value between 18.5 and 25 is considered normal, while something above 25 indicates overweight or obesity, and below 18.5 are indicative of being underweight. In general, values outside of this range are considered less healthy. Then we used waist to hip ratio. This is another measure of obesity, and it's calculated just by dividing each person's waist circumference by their hip circumference. It provides the information of obesity as well, with a little bit more detail into where the individual's fat is located. You might have heard the terms apple and pear-shaped to refer to one's body shape. People who have more weight around their waists, this is generally called apple shape, and this is subject to more health risks than people that have more weight around their hips, so pear-shaped figure people. This one is generally more healthy than this one. And finally, I'm going to mention some results for HDL cholesterol obtained from a biochemistry measurement of the individual's blood. And this is considered the good cholesterol, so the one that it's not bad for your cardiovascular disease. The environmental measures that we used in the study were all that were available in the Generation Scotland cohort. So we know sex and age of the individuals and the council area that they live in. We know information about their socioeconomic status. We have information about this deprivation index that I mentioned before as an assessment of the deprivation in the area where they live. And then years of education, some employment information, how many people live in their households, and so on. Finally, we have some lifestyle characteristics. All these are measured via questionnaires. All Generation Scotland volunteers took a questionnaire where they were asked a large amount of questions about their lifestyles. Some of them, these are quite tricky because I'm not sure about you, but I can barely remember what I ate yesterday. So replying to this question is not an easy task, and I'm always quite appreciative of the volunteers that contributed because they were really, really thorough and they did a great job. The information, again, is not perfect, but it's actually very useful. So from these questionnaires, we have information on the volunteers' diet based on what they ate the week before taking the questionnaire. And then they were asked how much fruit, how much vegetables, how much meat and chicken, fish, dairy, and egg they ate. We also have some information on physical activity, so how active they are when they're at work and in their leisure time, information about how much alcohol they drink and if they smoke, and if they do smoke, how much they smoke, etc. We can now analyze the contributions of the genes and the environment on our health-related measures of interest, and we can measure two things. Firstly, how much each component contributes to obesity in total. So from all the differences in obesity between individuals in Scotland, how much of those differences are driven by genetic differences and how much are driven by environmental differences. This represents the impact of those two things in the whole of the Scottish population. And the second thing we can measure affects the different regions. How much genetics and environments contribute to the difference in the council area. So is the fact that people are leaner in some areas like the Lothians due to genetic or to environmental causes? Okay, so let's go with the results. We have 4 traits. I'm going to start with height, so the one that is not related to obesity. We firstly checked the contribution of the 2 components, genetics and environment, to the variation between individuals in all Scotland. We can see that the differences between individuals are mostly driven by genetic differences, much more than environmental differences, which is a small value. The contribution of the environment is tiny, but this makes sense because although we know that things like diets have a big impact on people's height, all the individuals that we're examining here are adults, so their current diets cannot change how tall they're going to grow because they stopped growing a while back. You can also see that the percentages don't add up to 100. The remainder, this gap over here, is made up of variation for which we can't identify a source, such a measure or a known environmental influences that affect an individual. How big this gap is, in our knowledge, it also differs between traits. We then checked if we can find that the average height is the same in the different Scottish regions, or if we can find regional differences. And when we did that, we observed that some regions have taller people and others have shorter people on average. Finally, we've measured if these regional differences are driven by the genes or the environment. And the answer here is that the differences in height between Scottish regions are mostly driven by genetic differences. This means that regions that have taller people, it's because they have genetic variants that are making them taller. Now for the more interesting part. This is what we found on body mass index. Again, we found that the contribution to the overall variation is much larger from the genetic part than from the environmental part. So differences in body mass index between individuals in the whole of Scotland are explained by genetic effects and a little bit by environmental effects. But now the difference is not as large as it was before, and, although we have a gap of unknown sources that it's a bit larger than before. And actually, for body mass index, we also found that some individuals are leaner in some council areas of Scotland, as we know. But when we measure if the regional differences are driven by the genes or the environment, we found that unlike for height, differences in body mass index between Scottish regions are driven by environmental differences. So it's the fact that people in different regions eat different things or exercise more or less that it's causing the fact that some people are leaner in areas like the Lothians than in others. For the other two obesity-related traits, waist-to-hip ratio and HDL cholesterol, we can see the same pattern as in body mass index. Genetic variation is generally larger than environmental variation to explain general differences within the regions, but the differences between the regions are explained by the difference in lifestyle and socioeconomic components. We can also examine the effects of some of the lifestyles on body mass index. In this graph over here, you can see that, for example, some food choices that are associated with body mass, index, and if they are positively or negatively associated with them. So, for example, people in less deprived areas that exercise more and that eat more vegetables are generally leaner, while people that eat more meat or poultry have, in general, in average, higher body mass indexes. These are just a few examples and reflect patterns that might not be generally healthy. So some of them are, for example, how much vegetables you eat. We all know that eating vegetables is a good thing. But here, for example, you can see as well that people that smoke are in generally leaner than people that don't smoke. But that doesn't mean that smoking is a healthy choice. So it's sometimes a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, so to wrap up, I just want to remind you that obesity, and as many other diseases, has genetic and environmental causes. Therefore, your individual risk depends on your genes and your lifestyle. Now, since changing our genes is not feasible at the moment, it seems like the best approach to be healthy is to keep a healthy lifestyle, do some exercise, eat healthy food, and for health advice, find reliable information like the NHS or your GP. However, for differences between regions in Scotland, we observe that these are primarily driven by lifestyle, social, and economic differences, which makes that there are things that can be done about them. So like policy changes to try and help people to take better health choices so we can make these health inequalities disappear. I would like to thank all my collaborators and colleagues in the University of Edinburgh and elsewhere, and Generation Scotland volunteers, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Carmen. That was fascinating. A really great talk there. We've got lots of questions coming in, so we'll just jump right in. We'll start with Richard Oakley's got a question. He is asking, what do you think is the single thing we could all do to extend our lives in Scotland? It's quite a big question for you there, but I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think having a healthy lifestyle is easier to say than to do sometimes, and it's difficult to judge. I mean, I don't judge people based on what they eat because sometimes the choices are not as simple. I think having the knowledge what a good diet is probably the best thing that you can have, and there's a lot of information about that in the NHS and from your GP, and I think that's a good place to start. I like exercising, so that works for me, but it doesn't work for everybody. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Another question here from Richard. You spoke about BMI. How does high muscle mass affect BMI? Because obviously muscles increase your weight and therefore must increase your BMI.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's why I said that BMI is not a perfect measure for obesity. So actually people that have a lot of muscle mass have BMIs that are that would be classified as overweight or as obese. So that's it is not perfect. Now, it's not the same for the sort of analysis that we did this at a populational level. So we're not judging on each individual's condition. So it generally works at a population level, because it generally means that people above a threshold are overweight and people below the threshold are underweight. Now, as an individual, I think you have to take into account your individual circumstances, and people that exercise a lot and have a lot of muscle weight should probably not rely that much on the number. And in a way, I think at a personal level, the number is not that important. I mean, keeping a healthy lifestyle is probably a better idea than just focusing on the value.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We've got a question here from Freya. It is clear that medical research relies heavily on records based on a person's biological sex. Do you see any problems arising with the terms gender and sex being increasingly used interchangeably?
Yeah, so in our data, I use the word sex because because we have genetic data, we only use individuals that their sex chromosome sex matches their self-declared sex. This has issues, and I'm aware that in certain, I mean, taking into account these things would be important, and I think we should focus on try to have better data so we can include, because at the moment we're basically, I mean, if you have someone that has chromosomal sex that doesn't match the disclosed gender, that's not going to be taken into account in our analysis, and that's a pity, because we're losing people, we're losing data, and it shouldn't be the case. But because it's so problematic to know, I don't talk to people, so I don't know what's going on. I don't know if it's a mismatch. I don't know the reason. So at a personal level, from people using data, I'm very limited into what I can do. I think as scientists, we should focus and we should try to make an effort and to include everybody, because it would be really, really important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. We've got a question here from Sweden. Scotland has some of the largest council areas in Europe, except in the islands. What effect, if any, would having, say, 200 council areas to work with rather than 32 have on your analysis, would you think?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, the answer is I don't know, because it generally depends on how much people in total you have. So if you have 20,000 people and you have 300 counts, you divide them in 300 groups, you're going to have less power to detect the differences between them. If we had a large enough sample size, it would be much better, because sometimes, I mean, you can see that, for example, within cities, so in Glasgow, there are big differences within areas in Glasgow. So at the moment, I'm putting together everybody from Glasgow city jointly, and the same for other cities in Scotland. And it would provide a much better picture if we had more information on specific areas. But to do that, we need many more volunteers, because if not, we're diluting it so much that it's not possible. If I don't have one person for each council, that's not representative. That's just the one person. So so a combination of the two, it's important.
Yeah. Thank you. A question here from Heather. In this kind of analysis, how do you tease out lifestyle traits which may be passed down in families, such as an active lifestyle, eating habits, etc., and separate them from the genetic?
So I showed in one of my slides before, we know who is in the same family, so we evaluate those separately. It's a bit tricky, because some things are in families and you're not completely sure if they're completely genetic or genetic and environmental, because in a family, the family shares things genetically, but they also eat in the same table. Part of that is determined by their genes, but part of that, so there is a limit into how much we can pull them apart, but we include this knowledge as much as we have in our models. It's a really good thing that Generation Scotland has this information, so it helps a little bit separating the two, but it's never perfect, because it's not that clear on why one thing or the other is happening. For these results, I'm considering diet as something completely environmental. It's probably not fair, but in a way, I mean, what you eat is what you eat. It doesn't matter that much that it's genetically determined or not. It's what you eat. So that.
Okay, thank you. Following on from the question we had just before, Richard asks, what sample size would you need to get far more reliable result?
Ooh. I don't know. I'm not sure.
That's okay.
Very, very large.
Yes, yeah.
Ideally, maybe in the future, if we have information from everybody in Scotland, that would be the moment.
Well, I suppose ideally the more the better.
Yeah, but I think also in Generation Scotland, because there are some areas that are more representative than others. In one of my maps, you could see that most of our samples come from Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen. That was because of how the recruitment happened, and because if you take people from your family, generally families are in the same area. So there is enrichment in some areas over others. Ideally, having more information of the areas that we have less information would be good. But I cannot give you a number. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question here from Bill Graham. He says, since we can't do anything about our genetics, do you have a lifestyle elements benefit scale? Not sure.
No, I don't, and I think it's better to rely on. I mean, I'm not a medical professional or a nutritionist, so I think go to the NHS and talk to your GP. That's
okay. Thank you. We've got another question here from Paul Cooper. Do the genetic and environmental factors affect the susceptibility to obesity rather than a casual relationship?
Can you repeat that?
Sorry. Do the genetic and environmental factors affect the susceptibility to obesity rather than a casual relationship? I think you've answered this, but.
So, I mean, so I think it is known that both have so your genes affect your risk of obesity, and that is easy to test because you cannot change your genes. So, I mean, there is a relationship, and it cannot be that your obesity changes your genes because you cannot change your genes. So the link between genetics and obesity is causal, and there are a lot of studies showing that diets and physical activity have an impact on obesity. I suppose it can be also. I'm not sure if I'm understanding what this person wants me to answer, but there is some feedback into one thing and another, because sometimes, I mean, if you gain weight, suddenly you start exercising. So there's a little bit of ongoing in two directions. But the fact that it's a causal link for most of these things, I think is well known.
Okay, thank you. Our final question here from Richard. Is genetics as good a method of determining where you're from as carbon and oxygen markers?
I don't know.
That's okay.
I have no idea. So, I mean, it's not it. So genetics is not perfect for knowing where you're from, but it provides generally a good picture. So, I mean, targeting which council in Scotland, if you have one grandparent coming from a different place in Scotland, then it's going to be very, very messy. But if your family comes from a long line of Orcadians, it's relatively straightforward if you have good data to compare it with.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We've made it through all our questions. That's fantastic. This has been so interesting, Carmen. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for participating, and a huge thank you to our technical team behind the scenes. Without all their hard work over these last weeks and months, the Science Festival just would not have been possible this year. A few housekeeping things then before we end. Our next talk will be today at 3:30 p.m. Join us then to hear Dr. Shona Kerr with her talk, Viking Genes. If you'd like to expand on this morning's discussion, please do come along to the PD Kirk lunches and the Festival Club tonight. There are still spaces for the PD Kirk lunches, and you can register for these on the website. We'd also love to have you along to the Festival Club tonight. It's from 10 p.m. this evening. We should be sharing that in the live chat just now, but all these links can be found on the website too. If you are enjoying the festival, please do like our Facebook page and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That would be a great help to us. And with that, thank you again, Carmen, and to all of you, good morning and goodbye. Sorry, good afternoon and goodbye.